Security is a user experience problem. Opening the gap between intention and behavior. Here is a question that will reframe every security decision you make for the rest of your career. When a user writes their password on a sticky note and presses it to the underside of their keyboard, who failed? The instinctive answer from most security teams is the user. They violated the acceptable use policy. They received the training. They signed the acknowledgement form. The failure is theirs. The more honest answer, the one that separates practitioners who understand how security actually works from those who only understand how it should work, is this: the security team failed. They built a password policy so demanding that a human being, operating under the pressure of a normal working day, found it more cognitively expensive to memorize the password than to write it down. The sticky note is not a character flaw. It is a design signal. It is the user telling you in the clearest possible way that the system you built is incompatible with how human beings actually function. Security is a user experience problem. That statement feels uncomfortable to many people in this field. It sounds like it is asking security to compromise. It sounds like the beginning of a conversation where someone says we should make things easier at the expense of controls. But that reading misunderstands the principle entirely. What it is actually saying is this: a security control that users work around does not make the organization more secure. It makes it less secure. The most dangerous gap in any security program is not the firewall you forgot to configure. It is the control your users have learned to bypass because you made compliance more expensive than evasion. Every session in this library is built around attention. The tension at the heart of this one is ancient, and it will never fully resolve. Security, by its nature, resists. It introduces friction, barriers, verification steps, and delays. Usability, by its nature, removes friction. It simplifies, accelerates, and reduces cognitive load. Build a system with maximum security and minimum thought for usability, and you will get a system nobody can use efficiently, and paradoxically, a system that is less secure because people have learned 20 workarounds to survive inside it. Build a system with maximum usability and minimum thought for security, and you hand attackers a smooth road into your organization. The professional who understands this principle does not pick a side. They navigate the tension. They make deliberate decisions about where friction is justified and where it is not. They treat user behavior not as a deviation to punish, but as feedback to study. And they understand that the history of successful security programs is largely a history of making the secure path the path of least resistance. That is what this session is about. Not just the concept, but how it plays out in implementation, what it looks like when it fails, and what it demands of architects, awareness professionals, and analysts who each experience this tension from a different angle. The foundation: why users are not the problem you think they are. Security awareness professionals have been fighting the same battle for decades. They run phishing simulations, deliver annual training, put up posters, send newsletters, and measure click rates. And the click rates stay stubbornly high. Organizations with mature awareness programs still see employees clicking malicious links, sharing credentials over unencrypted channels, and using personal cloud storage for work documents. This persistent failure has a well-worn explanation in this industry. The human is the weakest link. The phrase appears in frameworks, in board presentations, in job descriptions. It is deployed as though it settles the matter. Humans are the problem, train them harder, penalize them more aggressively. But consider what that framing actually implies. If the human is the weakest link, and the human cannot be replaced, and training alone does not produce lasting behavioral change at the scale an organization needs, then the framing is operationally useless. It explains the failure without pointing toward a solution. A better framing, one that actually changes how you design security programs, is this. Humans respond rationally to the incentive structures and cognitive load you create for them. When they behave insecurely, it is because the secure option is harder than the insecure one. This is not a soft statement. It has concrete consequences for how you build systems. Think about the account lockout policy. The standard implementation locks a user out after a number of failed login attempts and either holds the account locked until a help desk agent unlocks it or releases it after a timeout period. This is a legitimate security control. Brute force attacks depend on being able to attempt thousands of passwords without interruption. A lockout policy interrupts that attempt. But what does it do to the user? If a user misremembers their password on a Monday morning after a weekend, after a system-enforced rotation, they get locked out. Getting unlocked requires calling the help desk. The help desk has a queue. The queue has a wait time. The user has a deadline. The next time they face this situation, they choose a more predictable password, one they will never forget because being locked out once was enough. The security control, applied without thought for the user experience, train the user to create a weaker credential. A well-calibrated lockout policy solves this differently. The threshold is set high enough that a legitimate user who miskeys their password twice is not locked out, but low enough that automated credential stuffing is interrupted. The lockout duration is short enough to feel like a speed bump rather than a wall. Self-service unlock is available for users who can verify their identity through an out-of-band channel. And alerting fires at the SOC when lockouts are occurring across multiple accounts in rapid succession, because that pattern is the real attack signal. The security is unchanged in its intent. The user experience is dramatically better, and the probability that users will create weak passwords to avoid lockout drops sharply. The same principle runs through every access control decision. Multi-factor authentication is one of the most effective security controls available, and also one of the most frequently cited sources of user friction. Deploying MFA for every login event, regardless of context, generates fatigue. Users start approving push notifications reflexively, without looking at whether they requested the authentication, without reading the context. This behavior is not carelessness. It is the human nervous system, adapting to an interruption that has become so frequent it no longer feels meaningful. The security industry has a name for the attack that exploits this: push bombing, or MFA fatigue. The attacker sends repeated push notifications until the user approves one to make the interruption stop. The control intended to stop unauthorized access was made so frictionful that it trained users to disable their own critical evaluation. The answer is not to remove MFA. It is to apply it intelligently. Risk-based or contextual authentication evaluates signals. Is this the user's normal device? Is this their normal location? Is the time of access unusual? Is the action they are attempting high stakes or routine? And only escalates to a second factor when the risk profile exceeds a threshold. The user who logs into their managed corporate laptop from their usual location at their usual time gets through with a single factor. The user who authenticates from an unrecognized IP, an unmanaged device at 2 in the morning, gets challenged heavily. The friction is proportional to the risk, and the user experiences the security system as smart rather than indiscriminate. That word smart matters more than it might initially seem. Users who experience security as smart, as something that seems to understand context and applies pressure where it matters, are far more likely to comply with it. Users who experience security as dumb, as a blunt instrument that treats every request with the same suspicion, are far more likely to root around it. Perceived reasonableness is not a soft metric. It is one of the primary predictors of compliance. The structural tension, when making it easier, makes it worse. Not every manifestation of this tension is benign. There are points along the security usability curve where relaxing friction genuinely expands the attack surface in ways that no compensating control can fully address. Understanding where those points are is what separates thoughtful balance from dangerous compromise. Single sign-on is a useful example of a control that improves usability and security simultaneously, until it does not. SSO allows a user to authenticate once to a central identity provider and access multiple applications from that single authenticated session. This is better for the user. One password to manage, one authentication event per working session, one credential to protect. This is also better for security in most dimensions. Instead of passwords for 12 different applications, each managed by a different team with different standards, you have one credential managed by the identity team with consistent standards, one place to enforce MFA, one event to monitor for anomalous access. But there is a failure mode. If that central identity provider is compromised, if the credentials for the SSO account are stolen, if the session token is hijacked, if the IDP itself has a vulnerability, the attacker gains access to every application connected to that SSO. What was a single point of strength is now a single point of failure. The usability improvement created a concentration of risk. The mitigation is not to abandon SSO. The mitigation is to harden the SSO entry point disproportionately. Hardware-based MFA, phishing-resistant authentication, continuous session validation, anomaly detection on the SSO platform itself. The architecture accepts the concentration of access in exchange for superior control management and user experience, and it compensates by making that concentration harder to breach than any individual application credential would have been. Password managers illustrate the same duality from a different angle. An enterprise password manager solves one of the most intractable human factors problems in security, the impossibility of expecting users to memorize dozens of strong, unique passwords. The password manager generates credentials that are long, random, and non-reusable. The user remembers one master passphrase. The actual passwords are effectively unguessable. This is an enormous security improvement over the realistic alternative, which is password reuse, short passwords, predictable patterns, or credentials stored in a browser with synchronization to personal accounts. But the password manager itself is now the crown jewel of the endpoint. It contains every credential the user has access to. If the master passphrase is weak, or if the device is compromised by malware that can harvest the manager's database, the attacker has not breached one account. They have breached all of them. The usability gain concentrates the risk in a way that demands the endpoint itself be hardened. EDR, full disk encryption, controlled application allowlisting, and a passphrase policy for the master credential that is the single thing the user must actually remember and must actually protect. Usability is also a vector that social engineers exploit directly. Help desk agents are trained to help. When a caller presents a plausible story, "I am traveling, I cannot receive my MFA push, I need my password reset urgently before an important call," the help desk agent faces a direct conflict between the security procedure and the job of being helpful. Every piece of their professional conditioning pulls towards solving the caller's problem. This is not a character weakness. It is the way every functional service organization is built. Business email compromise exploits exactly this. It does not need malware. It does not need a zero-day vulnerability. It needs an email from an address that looks like it belongs to the CEO, asking the finance controller to process an urgent wire transfer to a new vendor account. The email is polished. The story is plausible. The request is unusual enough to feel important and urgent enough to suppress careful evaluation. The usability of email as a communication medium. Its speed, Its informality, its accessibility, is the attack surface. The controls that address these social engineering vectors are not purely technical. They are procedural. Out-of-band verification for high-stakes actions. A second-factor confirmation channel for wire transfers above a threshold. A help desk verification protocol that does not allow password resets over the phone without cryptographic proof of identity. These controls make certain processes slightly less frictionless. The friction is placed intentionally, at the exact point where the attack would otherwise succeed. The architecture of frictionless security, how to build for both. The phrase frictionless security sounds like a marketing promise. In practice, it is a design discipline. It is the practice of understanding where friction genuinely reduces risk and where it merely annoys users without providing any corresponding security benefit, and then being ruthless about eliminating the second category. Zero Trust Network Access is the most prominent current example of this discipline applied at scale. The legacy VPN was never designed with user experience in mind. It was designed to create an encrypted tunnel between a remote device and the corporate network, and then treat everything inside that tunnel as trusted. From a security standpoint, this was already problematic. A compromised device inside the VPN tunnel had the same network access as a corporate server. From a usability standpoint, it was a disaster for a different reason. VPN connections are slow. They force all traffic through a corporate gateway regardless of whether that traffic needs to touch corporate resources. They require a separate client application. They break frequently. The authentication is often clunky. The result was entirely predictable. Developers found the VPN too slow for the latency-sensitive work of pushing code, running test environments, and accessing cloud-hosted development tools. They set up local lab servers, exposed them to the internet, and worked around the VPN entirely. This was not a conspiracy. It was a rational response to an unusable tool. The security team that built the VPN would have been horrified to discover these internet-exposed lab servers. But they created the conditions that made them inevitable. Zero Trust Network Access replaces the VPN model with identity-aware access. The user authenticates to an identity provider with appropriate MFA, and then requests access to a specific application. The ZTNA platform evaluates that request against a policy. Is this user authorized to access this application? Is the device they are using managed and in good posture? Is the access pattern consistent with their normal behavior? If all conditions are met, the platform grants access to that specific application only via a direct encrypted connection. The user experience is a browser-based login with SSO. It is faster than the VPN. It requires no dedicated client for most applications. It just works from the user's perspective. Notice what happened here. The security is strictly superior to the VPN in almost every dimension. There is no network-level access to anything beyond the specific application granted. Device posture is enforced before access is permitted. Every session is logged and tied to a specific identity, but the user experience improved dramatically. The shadow IT servers that were set up to work around the VPN were decommissioned not because the security team mandated it, but because the secure path became easier than the insecure one. This is the design principle in its most successful form. The secure path should always be the path of least resistance. When you achieve that, you do not need to rely on user compliance, on training, on policy enforcement, or on punitive measures. Users take the secure path because it is the obvious choice. Biometric authentication follows the same logic at the endpoint layer. Windows Hello and its equivalents allow users to authenticate to their device using a face scan or fingerprint. The enrollment is simple. The daily authentication is faster than typing a password. The underlying cryptography is stronger than most passwords users would choose. The security outcome is better. The usability outcome is dramatically better. The human who used to choose, summer 2024. Because it was the minimum complexity the policy would accept now authenticates in under a second with a gesture. They are already making dozens of times a day on their phone. The secure behavior became the natural behavior. Self-service portals address a different usability bottleneck, the cost of interacting with the security team for routine access tasks. When a user needs to reset a password, their options in a legacy environment are to call the help desk, wait in a queue, verify their identity over the phone, and wait for the agent to execute the reset. This process takes time. The user is blocked. The help desk spends time on a task that is not a security investigation. The security team measures the cost of every interaction as both user friction and help desk load. A self-service password reset portal eliminates the help desk from the routine. The user navigates to a portal, verifies their identity through pre-registered secondary factors, and resets their own password. The security is maintained. The portal requires identity verification, logs every action, and enforces password policy. The friction is dramatically reduced. The help desk is freed from the lowest value calls in their queue. The user is unblocked without waiting. Every party benefits. The pattern across all of these implementations is the same. The design question is not, how do we force users to behave securely? It is, how do we build a system where the secure behavior and the convenient behavior are the same behavior? Tools and the balance they strike. Every tool in this space represents a bet on where the friction belongs. Understanding that bet is how you deploy these tools wisely rather than creating new problems in the act of solving old ones. Windows Hello and FIDO2 biometric authentication deserve examination from both sides. The security case is strong. The private key never leaves the device. Authentication is bound to a specific piece of hardware, and there is no password to phish. An attacker who intercepts a login flow gains nothing they can replay. The usability case is equally strong. Users authenticate in under a second with a gesture that feels natural without memorizing or managing anything. The trade-offs are narrower than most controls. The enrollment process requires a managed, supported device and a setup experience that must be well documented for users who encounter it for the first time. The failure mode. What happens when the face scanner fails in low light, or the fingerprint reader cannot read a wet or scarred finger, requires a fallback path that must be carefully designed so that the fallback itself does not become the attack surface. The fallback must be harder to abuse than the biometric, not easier. Contextual or risk-based MFA is one of the highest value tools in this space precisely because it resolves the MFA fatigue problem without weakening the authentication model. The implementation demands careful signal selection. Location signals are imprecise. VPNs, travel, and mobile networks all create noise. Device signals require the device management infrastructure to provide reliable posture data, which means the MDM deployment must be mature before risk-based authentication can be trusted to honor it. Time signals are useful but not sufficient alone. The combination of signals, weighted by a policy engine, must be tested exhaustively before being deployed in enforcement mode rather than monitoring mode. The cost of getting this wrong is not a security failure. It is a wave of help desk calls from users who cannot access their systems because the risk engine flagged a normal situation as high risk. Enterprise password managers offer a trade-off that is almost always worth taking, but the failure mode is important to understand before you deploy them. The security improvement is real and substantial. The concentration of risk in the master credential and the device is equally real. Before deploying an enterprise password manager, the organization must have full disk encryption on all managed endpoints, EDR with behavioral detection capable of catching credential harvesting malware, and a policy for the master passphrase that requires length over complexity. A four-word passphrase is harder to crack than P at SSW01, and far easier for the user to remember. The password manager is only as strong as the endpoint it lives on, and the master credential that unlocks it. Self-service identity portals for password resets, access requests, MFA enrollment are a direct investment in reducing helpdesk-mediated friction without removing the verification layer that makes those processes secure. The implementation risk is in the verification logic. A self-service password reset portal that allows reset via a secondary email address the user registered themselves, without any additional out-of-band verification, can be abused by an attacker who has already compromised that secondary email. The verification chain must be designed so that a compromised second factor cannot trivially reset the primary credential. TOTP codes, push notifications to registered devices, or manager approval workflows all add resistance to this attack path, without adding meaningful friction for a legitimate user who genuinely forgot their password. Security awareness and phishing simulation platforms sit at the intersection of the people-focused and tool-focused approaches. These platforms deserve a considered discussion because they are widely deployed and widely misunderstood. A phishing simulation that catches users who click, records the click rate, and sends the clicker to a mandatory training module has accomplished something. But if that is the entirety of the program, it has accomplished far less than it appears. The click rate is a lagging indicator of the friction level of the correct behavior. If reporting a suspicious email requires navigating a complex internal ticketing system, writing a detailed description, and waiting days for a response, users will not report. They will delete and move on. The simulation measured their susceptibility but did not make reporting easier. The correct implementation pairs simulations with a one-click report button in the email client, with immediate automated feedback to the user, with rapid triage by the SOC or awareness team, and with a closing notification that tells the user what happened with their report. The experience of reporting becomes satisfying rather than effortful. Users who are rewarded with feedback become human sensors. That is the outcome you are actually building toward. Implementation. Designing systems that do not need to be fought. Let us move through the implementation terrain with specificity, because this is where well-intentioned design decisions produce outcomes nobody intended. Consider the task of implementing an internal incident reporting mechanism. The security requirement is that employees be able to report suspicious emails, potential incidents, and security concerns quickly. The usability requirement is that the mechanism be so simple that a user who suspects something wrong does not face any barrier between the suspicion and the report. Most organizations approach this incorrectly. They build a ticketing portal with a form that asks for the category of incident, the severity the reporter estimates, a description, supporting attachments, and their department. They announce it in a training session. They measure adoption quarterly. They wonder why employees still call the help desk or just delete suspicious emails. The right implementation works backward from the user's moment of decision. The user is looking at an email that feels wrong. They have maybe 30 seconds of attention to give to this before they move on. The reporting mechanism must fit inside those 30 seconds. That means a single button in the email client. One click, no form to fill out. The email header data, the timestamp, and the user's identity are captured automatically. The user gets an immediate acknowledgement. Thank you, this has been sent to the security team. The SOC receives the report in a format they can act on. The security outcome of this design is dramatically better than the portal design. Not because the portal is technically inferior, but because the portal produced a click rate of 2%, and the button produces a click rate of 30%. The control that gets used outperforms the control that is theoretically superior but practically ignored. Now consider implementing just-in-time privileged access for a team of database administrators. The security case for JIT is clear. Standing admin credentials to production databases are a high-value target. An attacker who compromises a database administrator's account or an insider who abuses standing access can operate for an extended period without triggering anomalous access alerts because the access looks normal. JIT eliminates standing privileges. Access is granted for a defined window, tied to a specific approved change ticket, and automatically revoked when the window closes or the task is marked complete. The usability concern is equally clear. If requesting JIT access takes 30 minutes, requires 3 approval layers, and must be coordinated across time zones, the DBA facing an urgent production issue at 11 at night will find the process unusable. They will either maintain a shadow set of standing credentials, just in case, or they will create permanent exceptions for emergency scenarios that gradually expand until the JIT framework is a fiction. The implementation that actually works builds the JIT mechanism into the workflow the DBA is already using. The change management ticket is the JIT request. When the ticket is approved, the PAM platform receives an automated notification and provisions the elevated session automatically. The DBA connects to the PAM vault, retrieves the time-bounded credential, and their session is recorded. When the ticket closes, the credential rotates. The DBA performed no additional steps beyond what the change management process already required. The security control was invisible from their perspective. The audit trail is comprehensive from the security team's perspective. The principle in both examples is the same. Design the secure path into the existing workflow rather than building a parallel secure workflow that competes with the existing one. Parallel processes lose, integrated processes win. Implementing centralized authentication for a mixed Linux and Windows environment is a third example worth working through, because it surfaces the multi-layer nature of the usability problem. The technical requirement is that users have a single credential that works across Windows workstations, Linux servers, and cloud-hosted applications. The business reason is obvious. A user who manages a separate set of credentials for Linux servers will use weaker credentials, will forget them more often, and will be harder to offboard when they leave. The implementation involves an identity provider, Active Directory, or a cloud-based IDP like Entra ID or Okta, and the integration of Linux systems into that authentication chain via SSSD or PAM modules that authenticate against LDAP or SAML. For cloud applications, OIDC or SAML Federation connects the same IDP to SaaS tools. The usability gain is immediate. The user has one credential. Password rotation in one place propagates everywhere. Offboarding disables one account and removes access everywhere. But the implementation risk is in the failure path. When the identity provider is unreachable because of a network partition, a misconfiguration, or a dependency failure during an infrastructure change, Linux servers that depend on LDAP for authentication become inaccessible. The break glass account, the local admin credential that is stored in the PAM vault and available only in documented emergency scenarios, must be tested before you need it. The most dangerous moment in a centralized authentication deployment is the first production outage of the IDP, and the most dangerous variant of that moment is when no one is certain whether the break glass procedure actually works. When the balance breaks, troubleshooting usability failures. Usability failures in security are often invisible until they generate incidents. The sticky note on the keyboard never appears in a log. The developer who set up an internet-exposed lab server does not file a change ticket. The employee using personal cloud storage for work documents does not announce it. You discover these behaviors either through monitoring and anomaly detection or through an incident that traces back to them. Working through these failures diagnostically is where this principle becomes most practically useful. Consider the scenario where monitoring reveals that employees across several departments are consistently using personal cloud storage services to share work documents, despite a policy that prohibits this and an internal SharePoint environment that is technically available. The instinctive response is enforcement. Block the personal cloud services at the proxy, send a reminder of the policy, increase monitoring. But before you enforce, you diagnose. Why are they using Dropbox or Google Drive instead of SharePoint? The answer is almost always one of three things. The first possibility is permissions. SharePoint's permission model is complex enough that many users cannot easily share a document with an external partner without involving it. The process is slow. The deadline is today. Dropbox works immediately. The second possibility is access. SharePoint requires corporate VPN for remote access. The VPN is slow or unreliable. Personal cloud storage works from anywhere without the VPN. The third possibility is familiarity. The users already know how to use the personal cloud service. SharePoint's interface is unfamiliar enough to feel like an obstacle. Each root cause demands a different fix. A permissions problem requires simplifying the external sharing workflow, perhaps a dedicated external sharing portal with appropriate DLP controls and expiration-enforced links. An access problem requires rethinking the remote access model, ZTNA instead of VPN, or direct publication of SharePoint through intra-app proxy. A familiarity problem requires training that is embedded into the workflow rather than delivered as a separate event. A pop-up guidance experience, the first time a user tries to share a document externally, for example. If you block personal cloud storage without solving the underlying problem, you will see the behavior migrate to a different platform, or you will see documents sent as email attachments, or you will see users finding a way to share files that is harder for you to monitor and control. The enforcement action without the design fix does not eliminate the risk. It drives it underground. Now consider a more acute failure scenario. A SOC team discovers that a critical alert, one indicating a host communicating with a known C2 infrastructure IP, sat unactioned for 11 hours. When the shift log is reviewed, the alert was present. It was visible in the queue. It was not acted upon because the queue contained over 4,000 other alerts, many of them of equivalent or higher labeled severity, and the analyst on duty triaged the queue from the top and never reached it in the allocated shift time. This is not an analyst failure. This is a system design failure. The alert queue is a user interface. The analyst is the user. The interface failed to surface the most critical item in the queue in a way that the analyst could not miss. The troubleshooting process begins with the alert taxonomy. How are alerts being classified and sorted in the queue? If severity is determined by the detection rule's static label rather than by dynamic enrichment, including context about the asset involved, the user associated with it, and the threat intelligence confidence level on the C2 IP, then the queue ordering is unreliable. A high-severity alert on a development sandbox and a high-severity alert on a production payment server look identical in the queue even though they represent vastly different risks. The second layer of the troubleshooting is the volume root cause. 4,000 alerts in a single shift is not a detection engineering problem. It is an alert quality problem. Running a frequency analysis on the alert sources will almost always reveal that 10 to 20% of the rules are responsible for 80% of the volume, and most of that volume is benign. Identifying those rules, auditing their true positive rate over the previous 60 days, and either tuning them to suppress low-value firings or retiring them entirely is the first action. The goal is not to reduce alerts for the sake of reducing alerts. It is to ensure that every alert in the queue has a higher than negligible probability of being a real threat, so that the analyst can give each one meaningful attention. The third layer is the interface itself. If the most critical alert cannot be surfaced visually in a way that demands the analyst's attention, a distinct color, a priority lane, an automatic escalation after a defined dwell time, then the queue is not serving the analyst. A SIM alert queue that treats a C2 communication alert identically to a failed login alert is not a tool. It is a heap. The UX of the analyst interface is as much a security control as the detection rule that generated the alert. A third failure scenario worth working through is the vishing attack that tricked the help desk into resetting a privileged account's password. The caller impersonated an executive. The story was plausible. The help desk agent, under social pressure and motivated by helpfulness, executed the reset without completing the out-of-band verification procedure. The result was an account compromise that took 14 hours to detect. The failure here has two components. The procedural component is that the verification step was not enforced. The human component is that the verification step was designed in a way that made skipping it feel reasonable under pressure. An out-of-band verification procedure that requires the agent to hang up, find the executive's official phone number in the corporate directory, call that number, and wait for a callback is technically correct, but practically onerous enough that an agent who feels urgency will rationalize skipping it. The fix addresses both layers. The procedural fix is to make the verification step mandatory and logged. The ticket cannot be closed as resolved without a verification code being entered, and the verification code is only generated by a callback to the registered number in the directory. The human factors fix is to make the verification process fast enough that skipping it does not feel like a time-saving option. A digital callback system that generates a 6-digit code and sends it to the registered number in under 30 seconds makes the verification step nearly effortless. The agent sends the callback, waits 30 seconds. The code arrives, the caller provides it, the reset proceeds. The friction is 30 seconds. The protection is substantial. The role perspectives, 3 seats at the same table. The security architect encounters this tension at the point of maximum leverage, the design phase, and their version of the problem is fundamentally about eliminating assumptions. Architects often build systems for an idealized user, technically capable, policy-aware, motivated to comply, operating under normal conditions. Real users are technically variable, policy-fatigued, motivated primarily by their actual job, and frequently operating under deadline pressure. Every assumption the architect makes about user behavior that does not match reality becomes a gap. When a zero-trust rollout creates unreachable applications, the architect's diagnosis must start with a question that should have been answered before enforcement began. What are the actual access patterns in this environment? Machine-to-machine communication, service account access, legacy applications that authenticate through NTLM rather than SAML. These are the entities that zero-trust enforcement breaks first, precisely because they were never modeled as users and were never enrolled in the identity framework. The architect who runs enforcement in monitoring mode for 60 to 90 days before switching to block mode will discover these entities in the logs. The architect who enforces immediately will discover them through production outages. The security awareness manager encounters this tension in a different register, the gap between the behavior the organization needs and the behavior the training produces. A department head who refuses to participate in mandatory security awareness training is not simply a compliance problem. They are a signal. Something about the training is failing to meet them where they are. It may be relevance. The training is generic rather than tailored to the risks that an executive at their level actually faces, such as whaling, business email compromise, and governance failures. It may be format. A 45-minute e-learning module delivered annually does not produce behavioral change. It may be framing, training that positions security as an IT concern rather than a leadership responsibility will always feel optional to someone who does not see themselves as an IT person. The engagement gap is a design problem. The manager who investigates it, who sits down with the department head and asks what would make this relevant to their actual work, will produce a fundamentally different training artifact than the one that generated the refusal. Executive-specific training that uses actual BEC examples from their industry, delivered in a 30-minute briefing with a peer who has experienced an attack, with a clear narrative about what the department head personally stands to lose, has a vastly different compliance probability than the standard module. The training content changed. The engagement strategy changed. The outcome changed. The SOC analyst at L2 and L3 level encounters this tension in the moment of alert triage, where the failure of someone else's usability design becomes their operational reality. A critical alert that was buried in noise is, from the analyst's perspective, a UX failure they are inheriting. Their role is both to respond to the immediate situation and to document the conditions that allowed it to develop. When an analyst sees that a legitimate user's account was used for a successful SSH login from an unfamiliar foreign IP, and the user denies being the source of that access, the analytical discipline required is the ability to hold uncertainty while acting. The analyst must act to contain the potential threat, blocking new connections from the source IP, initiating a soft session reset, notifying the user through an out-of-band channel, while simultaneously building the evidentiary picture, reviewing what the account did after login, correlating with MFA logs to determine whether the authentication was challenged and approved, checking whether the IP belongs to a VPN or anonymization service the user might legitimately use while traveling. The analyst's ability to do this work under time pressure depends directly on the quality of the tooling they have been given. An EDR with clear telemetry, a SIM that enriches alerts with asset context and threat intelligence at the time of generation rather than post hoc, and a user directory that is accurate and queryable. These are the infrastructure conditions that determine whether the analyst can do sophisticated triage in minutes or must spend hours correlating data from disconnected systems. The analyst's performance is inseparable from the usability of the tools they work with. Case scenario: the organization that broke the secure path. Here is the situation as it arrived. A mid-sized financial services firm, 200 developers, 40% working remotely. The corporate VPN has been operational for 6 years. Over that time, it has accumulated 3 generations of configuration changes, a capacity ceiling that was designed for 20% remote usage, and a TLS inspection policy that forces all traffic, including requests to GitHub, NPM registries, and cloud-hosted CI/CD platforms, through a central proxy that introduces 4 to 8 seconds of latency per request for the developer tools that make hundreds of requests per session. The developers noticed. Over approximately 18 months, a shadow infrastructure developed. 3 developers built a system of internet-exposed lab servers on personal cloud accounts. They shared the access credentials with the rest of the team. Within 6 months, 30 developers were regularly using these lab servers to avoid the VPN during development work. The servers were not managed. They had no EDR. They ran whatever package versions the developers found convenient. One of them was running an unpatched version of a web framework with a known remote code execution vulnerability. The security team discovered the infrastructure during a routine review of cloud spending. A developer had expensed a cloud server bill, and what they found was a shadow IT network that had been operating for over a year. The instinct was to enforce, block the lab servers, issue a formal policy reminder, penalize the developers who created the infrastructure. But the CISO, reviewing the incident, asked the right question first. Why did they do it? The answer was unambiguous. The VPN made their work impossible. The secure path was not viable for the work they were being paid to do. So they found a viable path and made it work without thought for what they were exposing. The investigation phase began with quantification. The VPN latency was measured under realistic developer workflow conditions, not the ping latency that the infrastructure team had been measuring, but the end-to-end latency for a GitHub pull request, an npm install of a large dependency tree, a CI pipeline webhook callback. The numbers were not 4 to 8 seconds per request in a vacuum. They were 16 to 40 seconds per developer action, compounded across a working day that contained hundreds of such actions. The developers were not exaggerating. The VPN was genuinely unusable for their workflow. The remediation began in parallel on 2 tracks. The immediate track was to contain the shadow infrastructure. The lab servers were inventoried. The security team negotiated with the development lead to bring them onto a managed platform, temporary cloud environments with EDR, OS patching, and network security groups enforced. Within 2 weeks, in exchange for a commitment that the VPN problem would be resolved before enforcement began. This was not a capitulation to the developers. It was a risk management decision. A compromised but discovered infrastructure that is now partially managed is a smaller risk than a compromised infrastructure that goes underground because the security team closed the visible instances. The long-term track was the replacement of the VPN. The architecture chosen was ZTNA, deployed with a 90-day rollout plan. The first 30 days were spent in discovery mode, mapping all the applications the developers actually needed to access, categorizing them by access pattern, and enrolling them in the ZTNA platform with appropriate policy definitions. The next 30 days were spent running ZTNA in parallel with the VPN, with developers testing the new access model alongside the old one and providing structured feedback on performance and experience. The final 30 days were enforcement. The VPN access for developer tooling was removed. ZTNA was the sole access path. The device posture control was the trade-off that required the most deliberate discussion. ZTNA access was conditioned on the device being a managed corporate endpoint with active EDR, current OS patches, and a device certificate issued by the corporate PKI. This meant that developers who had been using personal machines for development work, a practice that was technically against policy but practically common, could no longer access the ZTNA-protected applications from unmanaged devices. This was the correct decision from a security standpoint. It was also a real operational change for a subset of the team. The resolution was a device refresh program. Developers who needed more powerful machines than the corporate standard were given a budget to configure a corporate-managed machine that met their performance requirements. The machine was managed. The EDR was deployed. The developer got the hardware they needed. The posture requirement held. The outcome, measured 90 days after full enforcement, was this. Developer satisfaction with the access experience was higher than it had been with the VPN, measured by internal survey. Helpdesk tickets related to VPN connectivity dropped to 0 because there was no VPN. The shadow IT infrastructure had been fully decommissioned, not because the security team forced it, but because the secure path had become the convenient path. No developer with a working ZTNA connection had any reason to maintain a separate unmanaged lab server. The secure option was faster, more reliable, and required less maintenance than the alternative. The C2 communication alert that had been the original trigger for the investigation, a suspicious outbound connection from one of the Shadow Lab servers to a known malicious IP, which turned out to be the exploited web framework in use on one of the servers. was used as the case study in the post-incident review. The connection between the VPN was too slow, and an attacker had access to a developer environment for an unknown period, was made explicit in writing, signed by the CISO and the head of development, and used to reframe the relationship between the security team and the engineering organization from adversarial compliance enforcement to collaborative design. The cost of the remediation, the ZTNA licensing, the device refresh, the 90-day migration effort, was significant. It was also demonstrably lower than the cost of the scenario that the shadow infrastructure had been building toward. A fully compromised developer environment, a potential supply chain attack on the firm's software products, and a regulatory incident disclosure. The risk acceptance was explicit and documented. The ZTNA platform exposed application portals to the Internet, even if behind an identity-aware proxy. The mitigation was device posture enforcement. The residual risk was acknowledged, owned by a named person, reviewed quarterly, and visible to the security committee. This is what risk acceptance looks like when it is done correctly. Not a handwave, but a deliberate decision with compensating controls, an owner, and a review cycle. Closing, the practice of invisible security. The best security is invisible, not in the sense of hiding controls from users. Security through obscurity is its own category of failure and will be treated as such elsewhere. Invisible in the sense that users move through their working day doing their work, and the security is simply there, shaping their options in ways they experience as helpful rather than obstructive. That invisibility is not an accident. It does not emerge from buying the right products. It emerges from a discipline of design that asks, constantly and without embarrassment, why are users doing this instead of that? And follows the answer honestly wherever it leads. When a security team discovers shadow IT, the question is not, how do we stop this? The question is, what were we not providing that made this feel necessary? When click rates on phishing simulations remain high despite training, the question is not, how do we train harder? The question is, what made clicking feel like the right option? When privileged access requests are routinely bypassed through informal channels, the question is not, how do we enforce the formal channel? The question is, why is the informal channel cheaper to use than the formal one? These questions are harder than enforcement questions. They require humility about the controls you have built. They require conversation with the people who use those controls rather than about them. They require a willingness to accept that a policy written by the security team and rejected by the organization is not a failure of the organization. It is a failure of the policy. None of this means that users should be able to opt out of security. Non-negotiable controls exist. Some things must be enforced regardless of friction. Phishing-resistant MFA for privileged access, full disk encryption on all managed endpoints, no self-signed certificates in production. These are the controls where the risk of noncompliance exceeds any usability argument. They are the foundation that everything else is built on. But around that non-negotiable foundation, there is an enormous design space. And the difference between organizations that security practitioners describe as mature and those they describe as struggling is not usually the technology budget. It is the degree to which the security team has spent time in that design space, asking why their users behave the way they do, and building systems that work with that behavior rather than against it. Security is a user experience problem. Solve it the way designers solve problems, with curiosity about behavior, honesty about failure, and the discipline to keep iterating until the secure path and the easy path are the same path. End of session, mental model. Security is a user experience problem.